Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our penultimate panel at the Anti-SLAPP conference, which is called SLAPP, What Next? Those eagle-eyed amongst you will realise that I am not Rebecca Vincent from RSF, who's sadly been delayed in London traffic. So, aside from sort of any concerns of technical issues, turns out there's some issues with, in-person conferences as well. So hopefully Rebecca is winging her way towards us right now. But in the meantime, it's my great pleasure to introduce our fantastic panelists, three of which are on the stage with me. And we also have one beaming in from Malta, who's Matthew Caruana-Galizia. And hopefully we'll be hearing from Matthew not only the impact that SLAPPs have had, of course, on his mum, and who we've talked about during the last couple of days, but also his own experiences in the work that he's tried to do in her legacy with the Daphne Caruana-Galizia Foundation. So in Rebecca's absence, I'm going to just hand directly straight over to you, Matthew, to hear a little bit about your experiences, the impact on you, your mum, but also the wider impact in Malta and then what's happened since. And then hopefully we'll have Rebecca and she'll be able to introduce the rest of the panelists joining us today. Thank you. So, sorry, Matthew, just to stop you, but we can't hear you. We believe you might be muted. Just try again, if you can still hear me. Apologies, we'll just see if we can bring you back. Matthew, would you mind unplugging your headphones for us? We think that might be the problem. Sorry. Could you try speaking again? Okay, yeah. Thank you, Martin, for preempting me. I was about to say, given we're having in-person and technical difficulties, let me introduce Martin Bright, who is acting editor at Index of Censorship. So we'd be delighted if you would kick us off and share your experiences. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I mean, to a certain extent, I'm slightly embarrassed and in awe of following on from Matthew, or speaking with Matthew. We're talking about the impact of SLAPPs here today, and I have a sorry tale to tell, but it's as nothing as compared to the story of what happened in Malta. But bear with me, because I think it shows something of the historical context. It's a 20-year-old story, and in some ways it's a parable, in some ways it's a model of how this situation that we find ourselves in now came to be. It involves a character called Nadmi Auchi, who I first came across in the early 2000s when I was working at the Observer newspaper. We'd received a tip-off from the Conservative Party about the Labour Party, because that's often the way it happens, that they'd received a large donation from this Iraqi British billionaire. Nothing unusual in this particularly. At the time, the Labour Party was in its pomp, and everyone wanted to be Tony Blair's friend. The only problem was that Mr. Auchi was wanted for fraud in France. So, great story, rather simple story to tell. Auchi had been named as a key middleman in the giant, sprawling Elf Aquitaine scandal, which reached to the very highest levels of the French government. The oil company was paying bribes across Africa and the Middle East, a pattern that would be very familiar to people who've been speaking throughout this conference. And they've been paying these to win contracts and gain advantage for French interests. A Labour politician called Keith Vaz was effectively working for Mr. Auchi, but he was not the only politician on his board. The former Liberal Democrat leader, Lord Steele, was on his board. Former Conservative Chancellor Norman Lamont, also working for him, And Ouchie, it turned out, was a collector of politicians. Hi, Rebecca. Jacques Santer, the former president of the European Commission, is still on his board. This is quite a board, right? I mean, this is extraordinary. And in fact, later on, Ouchie even tried to suck Barack Obama into his circle of influence. This was someone, quite clearly, who believed he could act beyond the boundaries of the nation state. And he operated, let's say, I mean, one of the reasons I'm reading rather than sort of just speaking about this, because I do know this story incredibly well, is I have to be very careful about what I'm saying. So let's say he had a creative approach to the normal rules of business. And for a while, Mr. Ouchie was the gift that kept giving. I followed his trial for fraud in France, went there, sat in court, saw him receive his conviction, lengthy suspended sentence. In a series of stories, we looked closely into Ouchie's past and present business dealings, and others followed our lead. Stories started appearing about this man in the Telegraph, the Times, the international press. And it became particularly embarrassing when Ouchie's alleged links to a Chicago businessman called Tony Rezko were revealed. Now, Rezko was a Syrian-American fundraiser for the Democrat Party who eventually ended up with a 10-year prison sentence for corruption. Meanwhile, Ouchie was refused an entry visa to the United States. It's all looking great, right? So far, so good. The net appeared to be closing on our guy. Enter Carter Ruck. In the mid-2000s, someone advised Mr. Ouchie to hire the UK's most effective law firm, libel firm. And it was the best advice he ever received. It allowed Carter Ruck to develop a prototype of the sophisticated modern SLAPP action, which they've used to great effect ever since. And remember who you're talking about here, right? Have to be slightly careful here, but this is a man who has been convicted of a major international fraud in France, whose reputation is so damaged that he can't even travel to the United States. The Carter Ruck strategy was quite brilliant. They began writing to every UK newspaper who'd ever written about Ouchie, and simply stated they would sue, or he would sue, if they did not remove stories about their client from the website. The Observer, who I was working for, we initially laughed at this letter, and we pointed out to our lawyers that this man didn't really have a reputation to defend. He was a convicted fraudster. Now, Carter Ruck immediately shot back and said that the word fraudster was difficult for them because it implied a repeated action, and their client had a single conviction for fraud. They also pointed out that the conviction was in France, and therefore we would need to prove the allegations of fraud from scratch in the UK, in a UK law court. The lawyers at the Observer kind of shuffled their feet a little bit at this point, a little bit nervous, but they pushed back and Ouchie went away. Now you have to remember, at the time, it's hard to think this now. At the time, it was almost a badge of honour to be sued in a UK newspaper. It was like, you know, you'd have colleagues slapping you on the back. It was thought to be a sign of you doing your job correctly. But things were changing. In 2005, I joined the New Statesman as that magazine's political editor. And while I was there, I noticed that articles about Mr. Ouchie were disappearing from the web. So all these threats from Carter Ruck were beginning to work. The whitewashing of his reputation was gathering pace. At the time, I'd done some work with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and we had a conversation about this story and agreed to collaborate on a small publishing venture. We gathered as many articles as we could that were still around about Mr. Ouchie and created an archive to save these for posterity. And they are still there. Although most of them have been removed from the public record from the newspapers. I then wrote a short blog post for the New Statesman. I'm losing my place here, a bit like Boris Johnson, sorry. We'll save you from Peppa Pig at this point. I wrote a short blog post for the New Statesman expressing my disappointment that our brave national newspapers had backed down in the face of these libel threats. I also I put a little link into the cache of articles. And Carter Ruck struck back immediately, arguing that the link effectively represented the republication of all those articles. I'm going to name some names here. The New Statesman's editor, Jason Cowley, still the editor, and owner, Mark Danson, still the owner, folded immediately. They agreed to remove the post, pay substantial damages and costs, and apologise. This was not enough for Ouchie and Carter Ruck, who demanded a personal apology from me. Now, I found this really difficult because I was effectively being asked to apologise on behalf of all these other journalists who'd written all these other articles, right? I was effectively being asked to say that they were wrong. When I refused, the magazine cut me loose, and I was on my own. Over Christmas 2008, with 2 small children, I faced losing everything. My job, my house, my livelihood. The fact that this did not happen, I owe to the National Union of Journalists, who funded my case, and to another UK law firm, and this may come as a surprise to you, Mishcon de Rea, and Anthony Julius, the head of that firm, who agreed to represent me at a reduced rate initially, and then when the NUJ's money ran out, for free. Ouchie eventually walked away because, like so many people we've been talking about, he had absolutely no intention of going to court. He just wanted to close the stories down. As it happened, he chose to walk away on New Year's Day, so I was left to spend Christmas of that year wondering whether I was going to lose everything, but then received a letter on the 1st of January of the next year. And I seriously believe that, you know, though he walked away, he had dragged British journalism's reputation through the mud in the process. On the matter of legal letters, which we've discussed, I made the decision to share the Carter Ruck threat letter with Julian Assange, to warn him that they'd be coming for him next. Julian, in his inimitable style, published it on WikiLeaks immediately. I should have known he would do that, really. That's what he does. And this was then used by my employers to remove me from my job. Settlement I received was contingent on an NDA, which I subsequently ignored, obviously, and indeed I'm ignoring today. And I used my payoff to set up a youth employment charity. So what happened to Ouchie? Well, he was granted the freedom of the City of London in 2013. He was last seen in British politics cozying up to Nick Clegg on a Liberal Democrat platform. Lord Steele is still on his board. The Carter Ruck website boasts of its work, I mean, quite rightly in a way, boasts of its work in silencing publications that wrote about their client. He is a real success story for them. No one really writes about Ouchie anymore, which is how he likes it. So, he won, right? But there is a slight coda to this story. Just last year, the EU Observer was threatened with litigation over an article about a disinformation campaign against Daphne Caruana Galizia, allegedly carried out by a former Luxembourg spy called Frank Schneider and the private intelligence firm Sandstone. And guess who owns Sandstone? Now to meet Ouchie.
Thank you, Martin, and hello. I'm really sorry to be a little bit late joining you this afternoon, rather. Rebecca Vincent from Reporters Without Borders, and we've worked closely with many of the NGOs in this room together on our collective anti-SLAPP efforts, which we've been hearing a lot about in every panel so far. Can I just check if we're able to bring in Matthew Caruana Galizia? Is he online now? Great. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, Rebecca. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Okay. Matthew's joining us from Malta, of course, where he runs the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation in his mother's name. Matthew himself is a journalist and will speak to us today about not only the SLAPP cases that plagued his mother, but the continued situation, I believe, in Malta. And Matthew often doesn't add this, but as moderator, I'm going to prod him on this a bit to talk about the cases against him as well, as much as he's able to.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm glad that Martin went first, actually, because I think his the way he ended his story allows me to continue from that really well. I followed that case by Sandstone and Frank Schneider really closely because it was about something that concerned me directly, which is the fight for justice for my mother. And the sad thing is that, and this is why this campaign against SLAPPs is still so important to us, to my family, is that my mother was threatened many times with defamation lawsuits. And those threats were carried out. She was fighting close to 50 libel suits by the time of her murder, all at once. Those were the ones that were ongoing, not counting the ones that had been fought off. But after her murder, as journalists tried to continue her investigative work, worked on the investigation into her assassination itself, those same journalists were threatened with defamation action. And that, of course, includes the journalists at EU Observer that Martin mentioned, but it also includes the journalists who carried on investigations into, for example, Pilatus Bank, a particular private bank in Malta that my mother was investigating for its use by organized criminal groups to launder money. Organized criminal groups made up of high-level politicians. And the pattern that we saw in that case was near identical to what Martin describes, where we ignored the SLAPP threats against my mother. We campaigned against them, but we simply didn't respond to them legally, didn't take the threat seriously, because we had the same, we made the same judgment that the plaintiff simply didn't want to go to, or rather those threatening the action didn't want to go to court at all. They simply wanted to threaten us into submission. But what we noticed is that articles connected to this particular bank were slowly disappearing off the internet. And when we made an effort to find out why, either the editors of those media organizations didn't want to talk about it, or some very kind of anxiously passed on to us the legal threats that they had received, and were adamant that we should not discuss any of it publicly. The threats of legal action force these media organizations into submission. How were they able to do this? Media organizations have, especially in Malta, have very small budgets for legal defense, and they correctly want to spend the majority of their time working on their reports rather than defending them in court. For most media organizations, this is, again, correctly seen as a waste of time. They just want to move on with the work. And I agree with them. They should be free to focus on their investigative work. But, of course, I disagree that the solution to that is to have the articles deleted from the public record. The majority of these articles are of significant public interest. And very often we're proven right when it's too late, when the person making the threats is arrested for committing another crime, perhaps. So we're proposing, together with other various solutions that include defense funds, assistance in campaigning about the legal threat, and kind of making it a public relations problem for the companies that are making the threats. But again, these are all what I think are effective solutions, but we do not wish to spend the rest of our lives as campaigners doing the same thing, campaigning against individual SLAPP actions. I just feel like we're on a hamster wheel doing this. So our key campaign point is changing the situation permanently. How can we do this? Changing the laws that govern the procedures around defamation, both in jurisdictions that are frequently used as a kind of launching pad for defamation action, like the UK, but also across the entire European Union. Now, the really important thing to say is that the European Union's focus and national government's focus currently is defending journalists against cross-border actions in cases where governments are doing something to fight back against SLAPPs. But it's just really important to remind everyone that the majority of cases are not cross-border cases, even though these might be the ones that rank among the most damaging because the costs are so punitively high. But the majority of cases remain national ones. And this is particularly true for my mother. Yes, she was sued in the United States, and yes, she was threatened with defamation lawsuits that would have bankrupted her by Mishcon de Rea in London, but the majority of the cases against her were national cases. It's really important to remind everyone about this. So our focus in attacking SLAPPs, I believe, really has to remain there. We should start by eliminating the threat of cross-border cases as much as possible. But our focus really has to be on the national cases.
Thanks, Matthew. And really great that you've already started to get into some solutions and strategic approaches here, which I'd like to return to a bit later in the discussion. Matthew, could you maybe, in a bit more detail, describe the impact that these cases had on your mother when she was still alive, when she was still working? What was the impact of this on her day-to-day life and her journalism?
I think there are so many journalists out there who can relate to this experience because it's become such a commonplace problem where you spend the majority of your time as a journalist. I mean, first of all, you do incredibly diligent work. Almost all of the journalists I know do incredibly diligent work before publication, where you check every single thing. You go to all of the people mentioned in the story and get a comment from them, have a very lengthy back and forth with all of the people involved when they respond. Your articles are checked by numerous lawyers. So there's this incredible work that goes into every single article that the public simply never sees. They just imagine that journalists are sitting there at their computers, they get a tip, type up the story, and it goes out to publish. It's really not like that. And in effect, we're kind of punished for doing this work. So we do our work really diligently. And then when it gets out, we have to deal with all of the post-publication threats. And this was the case for my mother too. So she had these incredible sources and she did everything she could to protect them. And based on these sources, she was really sure of the of the reports that she published. But it's again, like has been said over and over again, the objective is not to show that the journalist was wrong, it's simply to shut them up. And very often this is done before cases go to trial. The problem for journalists like my mother is that the majority of the expenses are incurred before the trial. So my mother was constantly in and out of court. She forked out tens of thousands of euros for simply to respond to the lawsuits. Bear in mind that if you don't respond, you lose by default. The judge has no choice, or the magistrate in Malta's case has no choice but to find against the defendant. So not only was she spending huge amounts of money that she should have spent on her investigations, on improving her website, perhaps on personal things like going on holiday, which is something she rarely ever got to do. Instead, she was having to spend the majority of her money on defending against libel cases and the majority of her time on appearing in court.
Well, one of the quirks about Malta that is still surprising to people internationally, I think, as well, is the fact that these lawsuits against Daphne continued posthumously. In fact, a few of them still remain open to this day. Those are
It's
suits
so
brought by the
crazy
former...
that I forget that sometimes.
Yeah, so I'm reminding, and I'll get you to speak a bit about, if that's okay, Matthew. If I'm not mistaken, it's the suits brought by the former Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat, former Minister for Tourism, also known as the Panama Papers Minister, Conrad Mitzi, that remain open to this day. And Matthew, in fact, Joseph Muscat is still suing you, is that correct?
Yes, it's unbelievable. I mean, Joseph Muscat, the former Prime Minister of Malta, is still suing my dead mother. It's just a completely crazy situation. There were more than 10 other lawsuits. I believe there were about 30 that continued against my mother after her death. We fought these down to about 4 or 5, if I remember correctly, from about 30 to 40. Among the very few that still continue against my mother, that the former politicians have chosen to continue against my dead mother, are the ones filed by Conrad Mitzi, the former Minister of Energy, and the former Prime Minister of Malta, Joseph Muscat, who is also suing me, yes, over a Facebook post where I described a hypothetical scenario.
When I asked him about that, he said that your mother destabilized the nation with her reporting and that you were repeating the same story, and he refused to drop it, and to this day it continues.
I mean, what the former Prime Minister is saying there is that their corruption was so bad that reporting on that very corruption destabilized the nation. Their response, instead of justice for the corruption, was to shoot the messenger. Almost literally.
Exactly. Well, your mother's case is really special to so many of us, in part because it was the entry point for many of our organizations in working on SLAPP. We all know more about this issue because of the work that Matthew and his family have done on the ground. And it's really honed how we're able to respond to these sorts of cases internationally. So a little bit later, I'll bring in Flutura to talk about some of the tools available and what journalists facing these kind of threats can do, because it's really, as you're hearing, not just in this panel, but in other panels too, it's eerily similar country to country, regardless of the context, the types of threats that journalists are facing. I'll bring in now Katie Barker, who is an investigative reporter with BuzzFeed News, who has also faced her own experience, a bit different to the others, but maybe, Katie, I'll let you explain a bit yourself and maybe have a few questions for you as well.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's really cathartic, honestly, to hear about other people's experiences, because it can be very lonely to go through something like this, and it's just really, really great to, remember you're not alone, even as depressing as these stories are. It's also, it's helpful to know that there's solidarity. So I'm currently involved in ongoing litigation in the US and also in Ireland, interestingly, a country that I've never been and no one involved in the case lives in. So I can't comment on that litigation because it's ongoing, but I can talk a little bit about how I think the legal threats against reporters like me who report on sexual violence and sexual assault have changed and gotten worse in my experience over the past decade. So for over a decade, I've reported primarily on sexual violence, sexual misconduct, and usually about institutions. So about billion-dollar companies and Ivy League universities and powerful people and how they respond to allegations of sexual misconduct. So I'm no stranger to legal threats, and I'll be talking mostly about the U.S., which obviously the laws there are different than here. But most of my work, I work for a U.S. company, even though I'm based here. And I would say that there's two things that I think have led to it being the legal threats changing over the past few years. One of them was the Hulk Hogan versus Gawker lawsuit. I don't know, I won't go into the details here, but basically this former wrestler Hulk Hogan sued this online news publication Gawker. It was a privacy case, it wasn't a defamation case. Gawker had posted this sex tape, and it's a long story, but essentially the Gawker lost. A jury awarded Hulk Hogan over $100 million in Florida, and it came out that Peter Thiel, the billionaire PayPal founder, he's on Facebook board, I think, he was funding the whole thing. And at the time, I think a lot of journalists kind of ignored, or not ignored, but didn't really pay too much attention. It was a weird lawsuit. It was kind of a gross situation all around. I think a lot of journalists thought, well, Gawker shouldn't have posted this tape, but it had a real chilling effect on the media. And from then on, a lot of the legal threats I would get would because Gawker shut down. So Peter Thiel and Hulk Hogan effectively shut this website down. And so after that, even when I was getting threats for defamation, not privacy, the threats would say, well, look at what happened with Gawker. You don't want that to happen to you. And I know that's something a lot of other journalists have experienced. And then also I think that our former president, Donald Trump, his election really changed a lot for me in my experience in two ways. First, he appointed over 200 federal judges, and some of those judges are making really alarming decisions in regards to press freedoms right now. But more generally, he really created this culture of this war against the media where, like we were just discussing, most journalists are, I check, my stories are fact-checked, legal. I work so hard to make sure there's not one error in that story. But Trump really gave the impression to people that journalists are they all have an agenda. They're making everything up. There's kind of a war against the people, good people of America against journalists. And the threats I used to get in regards to these stories used to be about the facts of my stories, and those I never really cared that much about because I always stand by the facts of my stories. But after Trump, I got the impression that the defamation threats I was getting were less about asking for a correction or demanding something was different. It was more about this idea that if this case got to a jury or kind of got into a jurisdiction that would be more favorable, they could prove that I had a Me Too agenda, obviously, especially after Me Too. So instead of going after the details of my story, the threat started to be more like, you're just reporting on this because of your liberal bias, your Me Too agenda. And many of my sources are Republicans. I report on people from all over the political spectrum, and it was very kind of alarming to me to see this change because it's confusing to know how to respond to that because it's not really based in the reality of your reporting. It's based in the culture wars essentially. And so, I think that it's really taken a toll on me personally to have to kind of put in the additional work. We always put in lots of work vetting our stories and making sure they're legally sound, and that's part of my job, and I'm always happy to do that. But the increase I've seen in legal threats and litigation it's very taxing. And, I was talking to somebody, another lawyer, who said that as a journalist, our job is to figure out why someone's doing what they're doing. And, if someone is covering something up or funding some company, you go, well, why are they doing this? What's their motivation? And you get to the bottom of it. But when someone sues you, you can't I think the instinct is to say, like, why is this happening to me? There's no errors in my story. There's no corrections on it. Why, I'm such a careful reporter. How could someone possibly sue me? But the lawsuits aren't necessarily about you or your story. They're about, these kind of larger political purposes and also, defending the person's reputation and all of that. But that's kind of what I've seen in recent years, that it almost feels like not really about me. And it's very confusing and stressful to deal with. So that's kind of sums it up for me, but it's great to be here and hear everyone else's stories.
I'm interested in the case in Ireland in particular, and as you noted, you didn't have any connections there. Ireland has extremely high defamation awards, and so it can be a really scary jurisdiction, I think, if you face a suit like this. How did that impact you when you found that out? Has it impacted your work at all? Is it something now that you have to be conscious of going forward in this jurisdiction that maybe hadn't even occurred to you before?
Yeah, I wish I could say more about this case. I can't go into detail. I will say that I had no idea that I could be sued in another country that, as I said, I'm not Irish. The person suing me is not Irish. My colleague isn't Irish. I live in the UK. I've never been to Ireland, and if I have to go to court, it'll be in Dublin. It's not Northern Ireland. It's the Republic of Ireland. So, I genuinely had no idea that was even a possibility, but people are allowed to, you can argue that even if just a few people read the story in a country, you can go try your luck there and sue there. And, to me, I went, well, wouldn't someone think it was a bit embarrassing to, for an American not even to sue me here, to sue me in a totally different country. But yeah, I didn't even know it was possible. So no, I wouldn't say it's something I'm worrying about in terms of my work. And I'm really lucky. I'm a staff writer. I have amazing legal representation. I do not know how I would deal with this if I were a freelancer. I mean, it would affect the stories I did, no question. I'm very lucky that my costs are, paid for by my company, because that, they're suing my company, not just me. So yeah, we are pushing through, and we're just really making sure our reporting is as strong and as accurate as can be. And we're just, trying to do it despite these legal threats. But it's definitely, I don't think any of us got into this profession to do this, right? Like, I didn't become a journalist because I wanted to go to court in Ireland for, so it's hard, I'm joking about it, but it's a bizarre part of my job that I never expected to have to deal with.
I was struck by your comment that these types of cases are often not really about you, even though it can impact you so deeply on a personal level. I guess I'm shifting a bit more to the solution side that we'll get into later, but do you have any advice just based on your own experience if others find themselves in the same position?
Yeah, I think, I'm still going through it, so I think that it's hard for me to know, like maybe I'll feel differently after this all is resolved, hopefully, knock on wood, with, for the better. But I think I would say what that person told me that I brought up earlier, just that don't try and figure out why it's happening to you. In the US, maybe, these are kind of personal injury attorneys just looking to make money. I remember he said maybe someone at a barbecue just mentioned to the person suing you, why don't you prove that you didn't do anything wrong and try your luck? Like it doesn't necessarily mean that you deserve what's happening to you. And especially in my case, there's no corrections on my stories. There's no errors in it. Nothing's been requested like that. It's much different than that. And I think just remembering, I have no idea why this is happening to me, and it feels very unfair and unjust. And as journalists, we care a lot about justice, but you have to kind of just compartmentalize it. And the thing with a lawsuit is, at least with my lawsuits, it's like a lot will happen for a week or so, and then you don't really have to think about it for 6 months, and then a lot will happen, and this goes on for years, and you have to just kind of push it out of your mind. And at first, I found that kind of impossible, but it's been years now that I've been dealing with the one in the US, and I just try not to think about it. But maybe I would love more advice myself.
Certainly. Well, we'll bring in Flutura in a minute, who will have some advice and can point you in the right direction, although you're well supported by now, I'm sure. I'm also interested in the parallels, I think, between the sort of Me Too reporting and actually SLAPP, because one of the things that has made such a big difference in the last few years is that people have started to speak out about this, because before, I think often people would keep it to themselves, would comply possibly quietly, or would be scared to publicize what's happened to them. And I think it's really courageous. You, Katie, and every other person who has spoken in the past 2 days who is taking a stand and fighting back. I think there is strength in numbers, and we're all here to support you.
Thanks so much.
So I will, because we haven't had any questions from the online audience, I will just take a moment to point out you can use the chat function to put a question. I will see it here, and we'll open the floor up to questions in a few minutes' time. And of course, those here in the room as well are welcome to ask questions.
Can I just respond just briefly on the solidarity point? Solidarity is everything.
Yeah.
And there are a number of organisations in the room that specialise in solidarity for journalists, and we are so grateful. I think it's been a little bit of a long time coming with SLAPP cases, actually. I was very used to working on, for instance, official secrecy cases, a number of official secrecy cases over the years. And there's a kind of romance about that kind of case that means that if you're taking on the government, you're taking on the intelligence services, then people know what to do. They know that there's going to be a big case at a big criminal court. The banners come out, you have the solidarity of your fellow journalists, and you know how to run that kind of campaign. But there's something slightly different about SLAPP cases. And I think certainly 20 years ago when I was involved in my case, yes, there was a certain amount of, I suppose, embarrassment, shame involved in these kinds of cases where people don't really want to talk about them. You know, I was certainly in dispute with my own magazine. I kind of just wanted to get away from there. And it is, I think, hugely to the tribute of the organizations that are getting together with this fantastic coalition that really is changing. There are places to go. People do have networks, and that people can turn to others for advice. So I think, you know, that's a positive. That's something that really needs to be celebrated.
Part of the fight back.
Yeah.
Flutura, you are one of the most active people, I think, in this room, at least on the European level, in terms of championing our collective anti-SLAPP efforts and providing concrete support to journalists. Maybe, in fact, in case you weren't introduced properly earlier, you're the legal advisor for ECPMF, the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom. Flutura, could you maybe tell us a bit about how the coalition work has shaped up, what resources are available to journalists who find themselves in this position?
Thank you, Rebecca. First of all, just to say that it has been very difficult for me to be with this panel because it just reminds me, and I hope I will not start crying, but it reminds me that SLAPP destroy lives. I've been in contact and we are friends with Martin for 2 years now. We've been working together in the case of Jonathan Taylor, but I didn't know about his personal story. Thank you for sharing it. And also every time I hear Matthew and Daphne's family speaking about these cases, it reminds us that for all these people involved in SLAPPs, it's very difficult. You pay a personal price, no matter what happens with the case in the end. Yesterday we already discussed about the work that we're doing at European level with a lot of organizations, and I said this yesterday and I will say this today, that at European level, we were able to achieve quite a lot. We have pushed all European institutions to address SLAPPs. You have a report published by the European Parliament. You have Vera Jourova and the European Commission being quite active, and you have some very good positive news from Council of Europe for a potential recommendation. And we owe this achievement to Daphne Caruana Galizia and her family. And I can't thank enough Daphne's family, especially Matthew, for being so active, because they are fighting on several fronts. They have all this work that they have to do in Malta, and then on top of this, you have the anti-SLAPP work, which, as I mentioned yesterday, it has become a full-time job for all of us. Now we try as ECPMF, but also as the case coalition, we try to help journalists. The support we provide cannot even be compared with the resources that are available for rich people, businessmen and politicians. What we try to do first as ECPMF, we have a legal support program which provides financial support to journalists in need. This program started in 2015, and at that time we had a budget, please don't laugh, 10,000 euros. But because there were so many applications coming in and journalists asking for financial support, we have now around 100,000 euros available per year. We support journalists between 1,000 to 15,000 euros, depending on the case. For example, in Poland and Croatia, we've helped media houses with 15,000 euros because of the large amount of cases. We've supported around 100 journalists in different jurisdictions, mainly EU, but also candidate countries, including also other countries outside of the EU, such as Moldova, etc. As I said, this is very minor support compared to what is needed, but this is what we can do. I think what helps is the collaboration we have with other organizations, MLDI, FPU, Roripac Trust. They also have legal funds, and we collaborate very well together because there is so much need. We are able, for example, in cases where a journalist or a media house requires quite a lot of money, we come together, we put a fund together, and we support them. I think beyond, getting money for lawyers' fees is very important, but I think, and I thank Martin because he reminds us of the importance of showing solidarity with journalists. What has helped very often is not only the money that we've provided, but also the advocacy around the cases. We were able to mobilize ourselves very quickly. An example of this is the EU Observer case. We were quite active on the case that you mentioned, Martin, and I think the lawsuit never materialized, so we can get a bit of credit for that. So we're able to offer this package of services, which is the legal support, is statements of support co-signed by a lot of organizations, and in extreme cases, we're also able to bring journalists to Leipzig to stay there for up to 6 months, and we would provide all the financial support, etc. So this is kind of a combination of support. And now with the Case Coalition, what we're trying to do is to continue this work that a lot of organizations are doing. We're lucky we've gotten some financial support, and the idea is to continue this work with the Case Coalition at European level.
Thank you, Flutura. I will open the floor to questions in a minute, so please think of your questions. But we are going to have one intervention from the floor first, and that is from Sabile Raphael, the legal director at Protect UK, and she's going to speak to us a little bit about how these issues also impact whistleblowers, who, from RSS perspective, are often journalistic sources. So we work on them in our press freedom mandate as well.
Thanks. Yes, indeed, it's not just against journalists that SLAPP happen. It's also against workers, employees, raising their concerns to their employers, to the regulator, or indeed to the press. We have protection in the UK employment law, so it is illegal for an employer to dismiss an employee or victimize an employee who has blown the whistle. And the law also says that gagging clauses that prevent you from making a protected disclosure are void. But that's completely worthless. If workers are made to sign NDAs just like Martin had to, that forbid them to talk to anyone in extremely violent terms. And unlike Martin, they may not have access to legal advice from Mishcon Dereya telling them that's fine, you can completely ignore that. It's also completely worthless if you have the threat hanging over you of being dragged to the High Court for a breach of confidentiality, even if you won your employment tribunal case. So it's the same problems that we've heard today and yesterday, the sort of inequality of arms. It's completely worthless for employers to go to the High Court for a breach of confidentiality claim against one of their employees. In terms of money, they're unlikely to recover any sort of meaningful damages. But in terms of time and resources that the worker is going to have to allocate to that, of course, that makes perfect sense. Martin also mentioned the Official Secrets Act. Again, if you work in the public service, your employer may tell you that anything you say will fall foul of the OSA, and it doesn't have a public interest defense at the moment, and you risk imprisonment if you mention anything, even if it's in the public interest. So our beautiful legal rights are meaningless. And I have to confess to all the journalists in this room, I'm the legal director at Protect. We've been founded in '93. We've advised more than 45,000 whistleblowers to date. When we have a worker who calls us and say, hey, I've blown the whistle, I've been approached by the press, I want to tell them my story, the first thing we say is, oh, be careful, it's extremely dangerous. It will ruin your life, it will destroy your life, potentially. We think it's absolutely crucial for our well-being at work, to be in a psychologically safe place where you know you can report things when they go wrong. We think it's a basic human right. It's part of your freedom of expression. We also think it's a corner of democracy. So we think that law needs to be changed to protect whistleblowers and media freedom better. And it's not just defamation, it's also employment law, and it's also things like the Official Secrets Act. And we also think that maybe culture needs to be changed, and the way we look at this sharing of information, the whole framework of society also needs to be reviewed.
Thank you, Sabile. And as you've touched on the Official Secrets Act, it's worth noting that here in the UK, not only does our law lack a public interest defence, we're now facing some extremely alarming proposals by the Home Office that will make it easy to label journalists, whistleblowers and others as spies, with a prison sentence of up to 14 years for simply engaging in normal journalistic activity. So this is one of the most disturbing pieces of legislation I've seen from a press freedom perspective since we've opened our bureau here, for sure. And that's not even an example of SLAPP, because it's not even an abuse of the law. In that case, it's applying the law as it's intended. So just a flag for those interested in these issues here in the UK, we've got a big fight coming. And of course, in other jurisdictions, for example, the US Espionage Act, that also lacks a public interest defense, which is why we're able to see many of the cases targeting whistleblowers, and now a publisher, Julian Assange, as well in that jurisdiction. I've got no questions coming in online, so one more just shout out to our virtual audience to please type in questions. You have about 20 minutes left to do so. For now, I'm going to go in the room here. If we can get a mic over to Jessica, and then I'll come over to you next.
Hello, I'm Jessica from Index on Censorship as well. But my question is for Katie. First of all, Katie, maybe I should do what Oliver did earlier, and as an Irish person, I should apologise to you for being subject to our defamation laws. But thank you for raising it, even though you can't speak that much about it. But I wonder if you could tell us the lawyer who is representing the individual who is suing you. There are some particularly famous, I won't say infamous, lawyers who are acting in this regard. Maybe I can name Paul Tweed as one who is acting.
You got it.
So, yeah. Thank you for letting us know.
For the record, that was Paul Tweed. Just repeating. And yes, a question here, and then I'll come to you, Dan.
Thank you very much. Stephen DL, independent Russia analyst, although my question doesn't concern Russia, and I haven't worked full-time as a journalist for some years now. I listened to some of the sessions online yesterday. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. One thing that worries me greatly is what we're hearing. If I had hair, my hair would be standing on end with some of the things I've heard. But what worries me is if you go out on the street and stop someone and ask them, do they know about SLAPP? Do they know about what's going on? They won't. And it seems to me there's something of a vicious circle here, because journalists are being threatened, therefore it's difficult for journalists to talk about it, therefore people in the wider world aren't getting to hear about it. How do you square that circle? How do you get out of that situation where people don't know about it, so don't see how scary it is and how worrying it is, without telling them about it and therefore risking being sued? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Do you want to direct that to anybody in particular, or shall we bring in maybe who would like to take that first? Flitura, Martin?
I'm happy to take that initially. I mean, you're absolutely right, and you're right to think that this is a situation we should be, well, all our collective hair should be standing on end. I think one of the problems is that what's shifted from the time when it was a point of honour to have a libel suit to now is that the financial model of newspapers in particular has collapsed. So whereas previously there had been something of an equality of arms, that just is not there anymore. We're in a position where local newspapers in particular in this country do not fight libel actions, right? So if you are written about and you are relatively wealthy in the regions in the UK, you would be well advised to sue, right? Because the newspaper will collapse, they will fold, and they will not fight it. And unfortunately, that is increasingly becoming the case with national newspapers. What happens is that they make a judgment. Is this story big enough to fight? Who cares about this obscure kleptocrat in some part of the country or some part of the world that nobody really knows about? We managed to get the story in the paper. We hoped that no one would sue. They've sued, so therefore we can just pull it off the website. No one's going to even notice. I can only hope that new models of journalism, I mean, your publication is one of them, can operate in a way that gives them some sort of robust status that will allow them to fight back. But at present, yeah, I mean, you're right. Your analysis is correct, and I think it comes back to the financial model of our newspapers.
And I'd say, I mean, I'm really grateful to BuzzFeed News, my employer. They fight these cases really strongly, and we have an incredible track record, and our lawyers are fantastic. But I do think that the toll it takes on the journalist, him or herself, on me, it's like, I was, if BuzzFeed keeps fighting these lawsuits for years, I mean, that also means that I have to participate in it for years. And I can see why a journalist might at some point just go, let me get back to my work, I'll let it go. I mean, I think, it's really difficult to keep up the fight, especially when it does feel so isolating and you don't want to talk about it or can't talk about it with other people.
Can I just say two things very quickly? One is, very often in discussions about SLAPP, we end up looking for solutions from journalists, but this is not a problem of journalists. It's a problem which needs the intervention of politicians, governments, international organizations. And I am hopeful because 3 years ago, when we started to talk to people in the European Commission and Council of Europe, they didn't want to discuss this topic. Now it's the opposite. They want to address SLAPPs. So I'm hopeful. I'm more optimistic than you.
That's true, but at the same time, those newspapers that pull down those articles about Nadbi Auchi are a disgrace.
Absolutely.
I mean, they need, newspapers do need to show some mettle here because they have a duty to wider society. They choose the stories which make them look heroic, but meanwhile behind the scenes are pulling down articles as soon as anyone wealthy enough threatens to sue them. So, they do need to grow a pair.
And we also discussed before, not speaking about these lawsuits and trying to hide them from the public is not the solution. I know a lot of lawyers advise journalists not to talk about them. I disagree with most of them. There are maybe specific cases when you shouldn't talk, but in general, and we've been working with Matthew in several cases, especially in Malta, it's the opposite. You should publicize these cases, and very often these lawsuits either don't materialize or they are withdrawn.
Yeah, very often you can call their bluff, and of course that's a very personal decision to make, but as a campaigner I completely agree with that, Flutura. If this is not thrust into the spotlight, it will just continue. And maybe to add just a step further to what you said about newspapers, Martin, sometimes we see examples where journalists who are affiliated with media outlets are targeted, and not necessarily for something that was published in the paper, but something that they did as an individual. I'm thinking of one case in particular that I won't mention, but for example, a tweet where the content is similar to published reporting, and you don't always see the same support from that media outlet as they would give the same journalist if it was based on the article that they had published. So I think, in my view, that's a little bit cowardly as well, and I'd like to see more robust support from media outlets across the board. Okay, we have a few questions in here. Was this a follow-up to your earlier one, if you have a final point? Yeah.
Thank you. Now, this is, maybe I'm going going back to the future because it hasn't happened, but one thing which is, again, has come out in the last couple of days, is just how money screams. Money doesn't just shout, it absolutely screams. And as a big football fan, I have serious concerns about our game and the purchase recently of a Premiership football club for a vast sum of money by a group that there are some questions that should be asked. And I read something online laying out all the questions that should be asked. Now, as far as I know, they haven't been slapped, but people aren't asking the question. Here is someone who's asked the question: is he in danger? On his, it's an individual on a website. If they go after him because they've got the money, and they may well do, where does this end up? I mean, that I'm sure you know about the case the club I'm talking about, which is just outrageous. It was bad enough when a certain Russian bought a certain football club on money that came from dubious sources, but this guy is even worse than that.
Yeah, I think it's an open question. I think you're right. Should we take some?
And next it was Dan Gorman, and then Sarah Clark.
Hi there, I'm Dan Gorman from English Pen. Thank you so much for sharing your stories, everyone on the panel, and thank you, Flutora, for talking about the work that ECPMF is doing. I suppose my question is a very practical one in terms of advice from the panel. If you are a journalist who is facing what you think is potentially a SLAPP lawsuit, what would you do next? And I think also just bearing in mind Casey's point about the extra risks that freelancers face, it would be very helpful to know if there's any advice or thoughts from the panel on that. Thank you.
Can I share briefly our protocol? So in cases when we are contacted by journalists who are facing legal threats, this is before they are sued, they would contact us. We would ask with them to share their letters. In the beginning, 5 years ago, this was quite difficult. Now they're willing to share these letters. The first thing we would do is we would propose to them to go public about it, meaning we would prepare a short description of facts, put them on Mapping Media Freedom and Council of Europe platform, and especially the platform of Council of Europe is kind of a protection from them, because as soon as you connect your name with Council of Europe, also litigants are a bit more careful. Secondly, we would help them hire a lawyer. It's always the journalist who chooses the lawyer, and we tell them how much money we have available. There are a lot of good lawyers, because we've been naming and shaming a lot of lawyers here, but there are also some good lawyers helping journalists. So we would ask them to hire lawyers as soon as possible. And then lastly, we would get a statement, which is usually co-signed by a lot of organizations to publish it in support of that journalist. And we will, in cases when this is possible, with COVID it has been more difficult, we would monitor the cases at national level. We don't know of any case when this advice turned out to be a bad advice. The thing that we're struggling, I keep mentioning this, is with cases when journalists don't want to talk about these cases. These are cases with which we have difficulties. And as a result, we have more cases when the claimants, they did not file a lawsuit. They backed down because of this public pressure. But there are also cases which went to court and they are developing stories.
Maybe I could bring in Matthew as well. We've still got him online on the same question. Matthew, from your experience and your family's experience, do you have any practical advice that you'd give to others finding themselves in this situation?
Did I see Catherine Belton in the room? Yes.
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Hi. I just want to say that I'm a big fan. But also to say that, I mean, on the point of speaking out about these cases, which I think is always the right thing to do. I mean, the lawyers that are fighting cases on your behalf always want to have they always want to have kind of tight control over the case, which is why they would advise you to not speak publicly about it or something like that. But I don't always think that this is good advice. I mean, there's this really good scene in that film, The Trial of the Chicago 7, where one of the defendants in the case is arguing with his lawyer. And his lawyer is telling him, look, there are only two kinds of cases, criminal cases and civil cases. There's no such thing as a political case. But the key moment of the film comes when the lawyer realizes that this is a political case. And for many libel cases, I mean, I would say that it's the same thing. They're political cases. And with Catherine Belton, I mean, this point is proven extraordinarily well, because I believe the allegation being made by the claimants is that it's not true that they were ordered to make certain economic acquisitions. But I would say that, I mean, not only is that true, but also the order to sue the journalist making that allegation came from came from Putin himself. So we have this kind of sort of where the very fact that they're making this libel claim shows that the libel case is in itself political, and that the correct way to attack that case is to speak about it as much as possible, to show that it's a political case, to reveal the interests that are behind fighting that case, and so on. I really think that this is the right way to attack these kinds of cases. But again, to come back to what we were originally saying, of course, no one should have to endure what Catherine is enduring now. This is the whole point of our campaign, of our kind of strategic campaign, that laws have to change to make this kind of legal harassment impossible.
Thank you, Matthew. Catherine, I'll put you on the spot if you have anything you'd like to add, since Matthew did mention your case, but if you can't, we understand as well.
I'm happy to say thank you, and I'm very glad and honoured that you're mentioning my case for a very specific reason. I can't speak about it right now, but maybe I can in a week's time. It's an unfortunate point of timing right now, but I would love to have spoken today or yesterday. But I'm really very glad to be able to attend the forum. It is a kind of therapy. It is cathartic to hear that you are not alone and that others have undergone the same experiences. And it's been very, very useful for me to be here. So thank you, everyone.
And maybe in the meantime, we could add your book to our anti-SLAPP reading list collectively. Yes. Maybe we can circulate a list of books that have been mentioned in the past couple of days.
Can I just say something briefly about therapy, right? We were having a discussion earlier, in fact, about this, about the effects on journalists themselves. And we all like to see ourselves as sort of big, tough journalists. In some ways we are, and you certainly are. But I think it's fair to say that there is a particular effect that happens as a result of libel actions, and particularly lengthy libel actions. And I just wish that at the beginning of my process 20 years ago, that there'd been someone who'd taken me aside and said, look, this is going to have an effect on you personally. You know, you get to a position where you think, okay, well, I'll get to the court case, or I'll get to the point where they drop the case, or we'll get to the point where we can claim some sort of Pyrrhic victory, and then I'll move on to the next story. But you can probably tell from the way I talked during my little presentation, I'm still affected to this day by what happened during that case. Nothing, as I say, compared to what you're going through or what Matthew's gone through. But still, you know, I still get a croak in my voice. I still find it difficult to talk about it. And I think one of the things that Flutura and I have discussed is just the way that there really does need, with whistleblowers as well as journalists, some sort of intervention at a very early stage, just to say, look, you're not alone, and by the way, do you need some specialist help here, because this is going to be traumatic.
Can I just add to that? I don't think employers also realize that necessarily. No. For example, I had to take a few weeks this summer to prepare for a deposition and be deposed. That's a US thing. I don't think there's many depositions here, but it's incredibly taxing. And, you know, in my mind, I was just upset that it was taking away from the story I was working on, and I really just wanted to, I was very resentful of having to take the 2 weeks off, and I worked right up until it, and then I immediately went back into work. And I wish it's emotionally very taxing to have to go through that, to be, questioned on emails you wrote 5 years ago by, by these lawyers. And I really wish I had asked for that time off. And maybe advice I would give, even though I'm not a freelancer and I'm very grateful for the support my company gives me, is just to remember that, you do deserve the time that it takes to process and heal from going through this. And it's not shameful to be affected by it.
Flutura had mentioned earlier funds available for legal defense, but just to mention as well, a number of our organizations do have access to funds or can refer you elsewhere for mental health support as well. Not nearly enough, but there are resources there. So if anybody does need help in that regard, please get in touch with any of us. Okay. We have time, just a few minutes, for one final question. So I'll go to Sarah Clark here in the room.
Thanks, everyone. I just wanted to pick up on the issue of trial monitoring and how important that is in this process. So we've talked a lot about the need to publicise legal threatening letters and for the stories to be published. But something that we at Article 19 and many of the organisations in the room do all the time is show up in court to monitor the trials, and we also intervene. But it's extremely important to do this, not just out of solidarity, but also because it puts the judge often on notice that there's something wrong with a given case. And it's really great that Rupert is in the room, because we recently monitored one of his hearings in the Realtid case, which was an online hearing. And there was a large group of NGOs monitoring that case. And I think for a number of reasons, it was really important that we were there, because the defendants, who are Swedish, knew that we were there and we were with them in solidarity. But also the lawyers for the plaintiff knew that we were there and that our eyes were on them, because we're talking a lot about the lawyers who were implicated in taking and in devising the legal strategies around the plaintiff's case. And so I just wanted to really highlight the importance that I know it's very time consuming, but it's really worth being in the room, and a number of us have monitored the defamation cases in Malta. And it is, like, it's taxing, but it's totally worthwhile. And I'd also, as a shout out to funders, please do continue to fund people to show up at these cases, because it can both be an element of huge solidarity, but also it can really notify both the judge, the press, and the plaintiff and their lawyers that the world is watching. So thanks.
Absolutely, Sarah, and RSF does that kind of trial monitoring as well. Just to mention one practical thing for journalists facing these cases or their lawyers, you don't necessarily think of notifying us all when there is a hearing of interest, but many of us are interested and will come along if we can. So please don't hesitate to let us know. Even one of us, we all work together in coalitions, so can pass the information on to others. So that's okay. I'm getting looks here. Oh, we're right on 3:30. So I will just say thank you to the Justice for Journalists Foundation and to the Foreign Policy Centre for organising this conference. Thank you all to our panellists and to the audience, and for those joining online as well. And I hope this is just the beginning of an even more in-depth conversation and more joint efforts in the months and years to come.